Okay, everyone, we're just gonna get started here in a moment, so.
Everyone did.
You can go.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the April meeting of the Eugene Linden Northeast chapter of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We're being hosted by the Danvers Historical Society in their Captain Memorial Hall in downtown Danvers. A beautiful downtown Danvers. Tonight we're going to have if you can see, we have a special lecture. Actually, kind of nice that it ties into Danvers with the baby. But before we go to that, I have a few announcements. First, and I don't know how close I can get with this to you. Yeah, I just wanted to let folks know that the society, the Mass Archaeological Society, and the RSP, the Institute of Archaeology, are joint recipients of the Outstanding Public Archaeology Initiative Award for our Digging In lecture series, which was initiated during COVID. So it's a great achievement for both institutions. Ronnie gracefully agreed to pick this up at the attended conference where I was too frugal to go. The next item on our agenda is chapter elections. You still have time to send in nominations. All of the offices would love to be replaced. We've just been doing it for a long time, but we know that many people think it's a lot of work. It is, especially for Lindsay, because he ends up getting all of the speakers. John. No.
Yeah, John and I swap.
So I'm the current chair, Lindsay Randall is the current vice chair. Dick Miller, who's not here this evening, is our treasurer, and John Marcolakis is our program chair. If you ever have suggestions for a speaker, this is to our audience out in the Ethernet. Please send John or me or Lindsay an email, let us know when you get suggestions. But anyway, nominations are due to me by April 25th, and I'll immediately send out an email with the slate to the chapter members, which goes into my next thing. If you're not a member of the chapter, or the Mass Archaeological Society, or the Danvers Historical Society, I suggest strongly that you consider joining us. The chapter is only $6 a year. We use those funds to pay for a membership of our speakers in the MAS, as well as take them to dinner. Society starts at 30, but if you're seniors, 20. I'm a lifer, so I don't have to worry about that. Next month, we're going to have Kim Smith. Is it HRD?
Oh, I don't know.
I can't remember what Kim works now, so I don't advertise the wrong company. But she's going to talk about the work she's been doing with the wind farm projects on paleo landscape surveys and so on. And that lecture will be May 16th. And it'll be the end of our series until next fall. And I don't have the date in my head, I didn't write it down for the September meeting. So with that, I want to get right to tonight's lecture. By the bootstraps, labor. Rain disconnect. Labor, glass construction, and the shoe industry in 19th century Grafton, Mass. As I said earlier, Danvers also has that. So if you ever come here, you can see the display of baby shoes. They have a very large industry here for that. Our presenters are Lauren Schumacher, how appropriate, shoes, and Matt Becue. They're both second-year graduate students at UMass Boston, a wonderful institution, right, Lindsay?
Oh, yeah.
Lauren graduated got her bachelor's from Indiana University in anthropology. She's going to be an intern for the National Park Service at their Child Farm facility this summer. Matt graduated from Cornell University with a degree in history. He's currently an intern at the Massachusetts Historical Museum. So with that, I'd like to welcome you both. And let you get to it.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you guys for having us. We have a lot to cover, so I think we're just going to get right into it. So the Hassanamesit Woods Augustus Salisbury site was excavated by UMass Boston in 2015, 2017, 2018, and 2022. All of those years as a graduate field school. As part of the Grafton Land Trust, the site was confirmed to be the Augustus Salisbury homestead by georeferencing historic maps and tracing the chain of title using the Worcester County Registry of Deeds. From the chain of title and oral history of Eliphas, who owned the property in the late 19th century, and the artifact assemblage, we can confidently say that the site was occupied through the late 1890s, and that the house burned down in about 1990. And so these are the historical maps that we use to georeference. You can see it as the Salisbury right here at the very bottom, and then the Warren property up there later became the Salisbury property. And then here's the site map that we have. This is all of the places that we excavated over those years, and then in the top left corner here, that's where the house foundation is. But the material that we're looking at spreads over the entire site. But we'll get into this with you. All right, so also get into the kind of regional history later, but just to give you some historical context for Grafton specifically, John Warren purchased dispossessed Nipmuc land in 1815 from Royal Keith and continued to live there and farm there until his death in 1828. After his widow's death in 1837, the land transferred to the Drury's, where Royal Keith purchased it again in 1821. Royal Keith is a key figure in Grafton's history, and was in many ways the leader of Grafton's industrialization. In A History of Grafton, published in 1879, author Frederick Clifton Pierce describes Keith's career, describing how his father was killed during the American Revolution, forcing Keith to learn the shoemaking trade from his uncle to support his widowed mother and 4 siblings. According to Pierce, in the autumn of 1788, being then of nearly of age, he left Stanton and went to Boston to work for Mr. Hammond, who kept a custom shoe store near Faneuil Hall. In the spring of 1790, he left Boston and returned to Grafton, where he soon commenced the business of manufacturing shoes for sale in the markets of Boston and Providence. On the 17th of April, 1795, having become well established in his business, he purchased a house and 7 acres of land. The shoes that he specialized in were sail shoes, which were cheap, coarse-sewn shoes worn by both free laborers in the north and enslaved people in the south. Pierce claims that Keith transported his goods across land to Virginia after the embargoes of 1815. When he first began manufacturing, he packed goods in his flour barrels and old sugar boxes, carrying them to market with a 1-horse team and returning loaded with leather and other supplies. As his business increased, he had his boxes made by neighboring carpenters and transported his goods with a 2-horse team, which manner of doing business he continued till railways were invented in nearly the present time. So that kind of sets up all of the shoemaking industry in Grafton, just from Florida. By 1830s, shoemaking, leather, and textiles were the dominant industries in Grafton. In 1837, there were nearly 1,400 men and women employed in the production of nearly 700,000 pairs of boots and shoes, worth more than $600,000. While the shoemaking industry was hit hard by a depression in 1837, it recovered throughout the following decade and returned to pre-depression levels during the 1850s. But despite the expansion of the leather industry in the 1870s and 1880s, by the end of the century, only 2 boot and shoe factories remained. So knowing this, we began to ask what the material signature of that industrial change might look like at the Salisbury site. Ironically, Pierce, the guy who wrote the history of Grafton, posed the question best himself back in 1879. He said, "It would be a curious history to mark the progress of the shoe and leather business in Massachusetts, from the period of small beginnings when manufacturers like Royal Keith marketed their $300 worth of shoes in saddlebags and 1-horse teams, down to the present year when we're shipped from Boston alone over 1 million pieces of boots and shoes, indicating a trade to the single state of Massachusetts of more than $100 million, placing this great business in the front rank of all the manufacturers in America and making Boston the most important shoe and boot mart in the world." I think we can both say when we read that, we both laughed. We were like, this is exactly what we want to look at. And this guy had it in 1879. So we are fulfilling Pierce's legacy. So with this question, framing our research, we began to dig into the archaeological and documentary materials. And a few problems became immediately clear. First, the site really does not have a clear stratigraphy. Contexts are extremely mixed, with things such as tin glazed ceramics and gun flints that are mixed in with bottles from the 1880s within the top 10 centimeters of soil. This makes traditional dating methods such as mean ceramic dating somewhat irrelevant. It's really hard to date the site using traditional methods. Additionally, artifacts are spread across the site, with crossbones coming from units nearly 12 meters away from each other, making spatial interpretation also very difficult. Furthermore, from census records, we know that the site is characterized by multiple short occupations by several people. So this means that material cannot be associated with any one particular family, but rather must be considered representative of a class of people. Another problem is that while we can confidently say who is living at the site while Augustus Salisbury is present, on the census records, once he leaves the site in 1865, it becomes impossible to say who exactly was living at the site when. In her oral history, Ella Fisk lists the families who lived there after Salisbury, but it must be met with a certain degree of skepticism, as she was remembering back decades when the oral history was recorded. Finally, there are seemingly no similar sites of comparison for a couple reasons. First of all, this kind of rapid turnover that we're seeing at the site would not be uncommon in urban settings, but seems to be really unique in this rural context. There are plenty of archaeological studies of urban housing and housing in tenements, but none that focus on multi-family rural occupations. Second, at least to my knowledge, the shoemaking materials that we have here at Salisbury have not been discussed archaeologically at any other site, while other archaeological studies on shoes have focused on the shoes themselves. They don't appear to discuss any kind of shoemaking tools or modes of production, which has been making artifact identification and interpretation a little bit more challenging. However, despite these problems, this site offers a few exciting opportunities. First, rather than doing a deep dive into a singular family or occupation, as many people do with farmsteads, we have the opportunity to understand a highly mobile working class and their contested class identities during a period of rapid socioeconomic change. This approach gives us a bit more interpretive freedom than what is typically afforded at rural sites, and has allowed us to pursue multiple avenues of interpreting this. All right, so these are our main questions that we've been looking at while we're interviewing the site. The first two are more what I've been looking at, and what math is. So I have what kind of social networks characterize the labor at the site, and how does Augustus Salisbury function as a site for socioeconomic transformation for laborers? And then Matt is looking at what consumption and production activities occurred at the site, and what do they say about the occupants' class and other identities, and how do people see themselves versus how are they seen by the rest of society. All right, so I'm going to begin by talking about Augustus Salisbury. This is getting into the documentary research that we've conducted. Augustus Salisbury was born about 1810 in Rhode Island, and according to the deed research, Augustus's father purchased property from royalty in 1849 and mortgaged it to Augustus, who lived there until 1865. And Augustus is kind of a odd figure. He's a bachelor, he's not from Grafton, and he's trying to farm as a single person. He does eventually marry Elvira Simmons, a 35-year-old widow, when he's 50, but the two don't appear to have any children. He sells the property to Henry R. Keith in 1865, and then he drops off the record entirely until he dies in Hillingdon, Connecticut in 1880. So the big question here is, as a single man, how is Augustus making these things work on his property? As Ella Fisk remembers, he worked out and had the family in the house to board him. Therefore, we can assume that the people who we're about to discuss were not just tenants, but also people that Augustus lived and worked with. Okay, so in the following discussion of the documentary research, I'm going to present the male head of each family, just for simplicity's sake, and outline any relevant familial or social connections, and then discuss their movement patterns. Also, Augustus is listed in every census, but I've left him out just to avoid redundancy. To begin in 1850, we have the Plums and the Prentices, as you can see up here. The Prentices are their ages that are marked on the census. Alan Plum is a bootmaker by trade, and after moving to Grafton from Upton, moving from Grafton to Upton, he continues to make boots until his death in 1871. Plum's wife Sarah is Augustus's sister, and it's likely that she and her husband moved to Grafton with Augustus to get him settled, and for Sarah to perform gendered domestic labor, such as washing and cooking in the absence of another woman. Henry Prentice is a farmer from Grafton who's living at the Salisbury site with his wife, his children, and along with his wife's sister and her mother. Following their time at Salisbury, the apprentices go on to own their own land and live in a single-family household until 1870, where they're documented as living with the Morse family, who notably also lived at the Salisbury site later. Throughout their time in Grafton, the apprentices actually lived near several of the families who occupied the Salisbury site, indicating the presence of a social and labor network here. And then this is just the census record where you can see Augustus Salisbury lives at the top of the farms and the apprentices. And they're living right next to royalty, who again is that big shoe manufacturer. But since he's living in the rural part of town, he's also a farmer. We're saying that this is a really important kind of moment of self-identification as wanting to identify more of the rural, almost gentry class rather than the industrial shoemaking class. And then Royal's son Henry. Down here you can see shoe manufacturer, but scribbled out with shoemaker. And that's a really important distinction. You're not a laborer, you're someone who's owning that capital and who's, you know, an employer rather than an employee as a manufacturer. So it's just a really cool physical way of seeing that distinction between laborer and employer. So moving to 1855, the two families at the site are the Bassets and the Davises. Both work in the shoe industry, making this the record the first that has no other self-identified farmer besides Augustus Salisbury at the site. These two families are related, with Bassett's sister Cyrena being Davis's wife. Tracking each family's history, Bassett remains a shoemaker and a bootmaker until 1865, where then he's listed as a farmer. And like with the apprentices, or similarly, Davis is listed as both a shoe and bootmaker until 1870, where he's also listed as a farmer. Like with the apprentices, both of these families can also be considered examples of upward economic mobility following their time at Salisbury, as both go on to work their own land and to live as single families. And that's the census record. This one's also kind of interesting that Augustus Salisbury is listed in the middle of the family, not at the top, even though he owns the property. So again, just kind of his position as a single man is very different than the peasants. Okay, in 1860, we have the Smiths and Lucius Boyden. Smith and his wife, Margaret, are both Irish immigrants, and while Smith is listed as a farmer, he actually worked as a boot treer in 1850 and 1865. That's someone who would shape boots after they were made. So following their time at Salisbury, the Smiths actually lived as a single-family household on their own property, showing the same kind of economic mobility as the previous occupants. But they continue to be neighbors with other families who also lived at Salisbury, further emphasizing the presence of a greater network at play. Lucius Boyden's story was tragically cut short. He died while serving the Union Army in August of 1862, leaving his 20-year-old wife and widow for the second time. And that's the census record again. You can see the shoemaker, and then also place of birth listed as that. Okay. In 1865, we have the Morses and the Wheelers. Now, while they all have different occupations listed on the census, all three men worked as bootmakers previously. Like in previous occupations, these families are connected through marriage. Eliphalet and Caleb Wheeler's sister, Phoebe, is married to Warren Morse. Together, this continues to show the crossover of social and labor networks in Grafton at this time. During and immediately after his time at Salisbury, Morse is listed as a farmer. However, by 1880, he's living in Worcester and is working at Walter Haywood Chair Manufacturing, according to the Worcester City Registry. While his occupation is unknown, he moves to Fitchburg in 1900 and by 1910 is a farmer once again. This case demonstrates the high degree of physical and economic mobility that characterized the laboring class at this time. On the other hand, the Wheelers were raised in shoemaking and continued to make shoes in Worcester throughout the 1930s. However, in each year following their stay at Salisbury, the number of shoemakers on the census notably declines, until Eliphalet is the only shoemaker working in a shoe shop, not a factory, for pages, thus reflecting a decline, or at least a shift in the modes of production in the shoe industry. So when Augustus Salisbury leaves the property, here's that census record. This one's just kind of fun and he's on the soldier up there. This is in the middle of this. And then, so 1865 and the 70s, after Augustus Salisbury leaves the property in 1865, the occupation history becomes more blurred, partially due to the fact that the owners no longer live on the property, and because the only censuses available are the federal census, which was only taken every 10 years, whereas the state census was taken every 5 years. The families that occupy the site after Salisbury are the Caseys and the Murphys. Both are immigrant laborers who are related by marriage. While they were farm laborers in Grafton, both moved to Northbridge during the 1870s, where both families, including many of their children, worked in the cotton mills. This may indicate downwards economic mobility, as both moved to more urban, multifamily households and are even listed as being unemployed for several months. This also reflects a change in the site's function, as the centralization of the shoe industry made it harder to maintain the mode of production that was seen earlier in the earlier decades. This transition carries through the next occupants, the Rogers and the Bakers, both of whom lived on the site as single-family households and were occupied as general laborers and mill workers rather than shoemakers. I just want to take a second to talk about all of Rogers here because we'll talk about her more later in the presentation. And she was a really cool case that we were able to pull out of that oral history, where her husband, Elbridge Rogers, vacated, is how Elspeth describes it. Leaving Olive with their 7 children who were aged 2 to 19. And according to this, to provide for her family, she took in 14 washings and 3 ironings every week. So on that census record, she's listed as the head of house. There's no other man in the household. She's fully providing for her family. And her oldest children work in the shoe factory, and also notably her oldest daughter works in the shoe factory, which was the first case I have ever seen of a woman working in a shoe factory that was listed on the census. They're also hosting a boarder, who is another young man, who's working in a currying shop, so with leather. Eventually Olive remarries and then she moves to Worcester, so things do turn out from her in the end, but it's just a really sweet story to be able to kind of unwrap it. So this documentary data has not only allowed us to explore the rich lives of individuals who occupied Augustus Salisbury, it has also allowed us to understand the socioeconomic networks that characterize the site. These demographics show large young families that comprise the bulk of occupants, with very few instances of single men at the site. The fact that Salisbury, as a property owner, is consistently the only single man on these census records speak to how the site was operated. As a bachelor farmer, it is likely that Salisbury rented these families to utilize their labor, both on his farm and in his household. As Elspeth states in her oral history of the Salisbury place, Salisbury had a family in the house to board him, meaning that in this arrangement, Salisbury provided work and housing, while families, specifically women, would have provided domestic services such as cooking for him. Additionally, this model may have been attractive to working class families due to the potential to build capital, as evidenced by the multiple families who went on to own property or to live as a single-family household following their stay at the Salisbury place. Elspeth even mentions children who grew up at Salisbury, calling her years later to tell her how much they had made of themselves. Finally, this site's location on the outskirts of town may have also been desirable for families wishing to live more independently. As Matt will discuss later, people who lived at Augustus Salisbury would have been able to drink and smoke as they pleased, worked more flexible hours, supervise their children while at work, and raise their children outside of the increasingly industrial town center. This data also speaks to the multiple networks present at the site. Notably, most occupants are related through marriage. This was discovered through my tracking process, as marriage records or earlier census records revealed maiden names and parentage. This not only speaks to the historical conceptions of the family unit, which included extended family, but also to the interconnected nature of labor. The repeated instances of Salisbury occupants being the neighbors, either before or after their time at Salisbury, reinforce the notion that family, work, and social ties were often one and the same. This is especially true for the pre-factory era, because before work became more specialized and workers became divorced from the value and the social context of their labor. Finally, this data reflects both the economic mobility of the occupants and the greater trends in the industry during this transitional period. As previously stated, several families go on to own land or at least live as a single family, rather than in boarding houses with multiple families. However, despite these successes, it is essential to note that these laborers do not become capitalists. In no instance does a worker become a manufacturer, or work his way to owning his own shop. These mid-century laborers continue to be laborers, if in slightly different socioeconomic contexts following their occupation at Salisbury. Furthermore, there are also seemingly examples of downward mobility. In the case of the Murphys and the Caseys, both families are left farming and living as a single family and moved into industrial centers, where the children worked in cotton mills, while Murphy and Casey were unemployed farm workers. Along with all of Rogers and the Bakers, the unspecialized labor that characterizes the post-Salisbury period of the site reflects the town's transition to a factory system, where manufacturing would have been conducted in a centralized location rather than in dispersed workshops, prompting those engaged in the shoe and textile or leather industries to increasingly move to the center and leaving the rural outskirts. Leave the rural outskirts to become socioeconomic outskirts as well. This is further reflected by the lack of social ties amongst those who occupied the site after 1865. Whereas between 1850 and 1865, many of the Salisbury occupants were neighbors at some point during their time in Grafton, none of the families who live at the site after 1865 seem to be associated with one another, indicating a growing divide between social and labor networks during this period of industrialization. All right, so now we're going to move on to the exciting stuff within the shoe industry and our material analysis. So yeah, let's just start with the shoes for our materials as have been kind of the cornerstone of the site's interpretation. So from our documentary analysis, we knew that there were shoemakers living at the site, but this alone could be relatively unremarkable given the extent of the business in Grafton during this time. However, compared to other archaeological studies on shoes, this assemblage is unique in that it is nearly entirely comprised of shoemaking tools rather than leather straps or the shoes themselves. We initially thought these to be heel plates, which were small iron plates that could be nailed onto boot soles in order to extend their use. In this context, the presence of heel plates likely would have suggested a type of supplemental outward rather than extensive production, leading us to believe that the main form of labor taking place at the site was farm work. While looking for visual examples of the boot making process, I discovered steel last plates. Whereas heel plates are flat and shaped more like a horseshoe, last plates are larger, slightly concave, and are easily identified by the large hole in the center and the 5 smaller holes along the edge. And so you can see on the top right, that's what we have excavated from Salisbury, and then in the bottom right, that's what a steel last plate looks like, attached to a wooden last. Lasts are wooden forms shaped like a foot, but the shoe is built around. Last plates are nailed to the bottom of the last. When the upper is attached to the sole with brass tacks, last plates keep the tacks from piercing through the insole. So you can see this is what shoes would have looked like when they were introduced to the lasting process. So you have all of the top leather of the shoe put in place, and then you're going to attach it to the sole on the bottom using tacks. And then the tacks would have bent under when it hit the steel plate rather than piercing into the wood. So this saves the shoemaker time, as they don't have to trim the tacks, and also creates a more comfortable shoe. Importantly, this is one of the last steps in the shoemaking process. Once the upper is attached to the sole, the shoe is essentially complete. This realization changed our entire interpretation of the site. Rather than being piecework or supplemental repair or cobbling, the presence of last plates indicates the production of complete shoes. Therefore, this site more likely represents the 10-footer model of shoe production. Named for being 10 by 10 feet square, 10-footers represent a period between domestic and competitive industrial production. Before the early 19th century, shoes were produced for the domestic market, and shoemaking was not a specialized craft. Instead, farmers and fishermen produced shoes for their families and neighbors in the off-season. However, with tariffs on British goods following the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, shoes needed to be mass-produced by and for Americans, particularly their enslaved workforce. And so shoemaking became a specialized industry. Initially, merchants supplied materials to shoemakers and in turn sold the finished products on the market, like what royalties would have been doing back in the day. But these products were not of high quality, and shoemakers often took extra leather to make shoes of their own for profit on the side. In response, merchants became manufacturers, centralizing production to ensure less wasteful cutting and to control the quality of the finished product. Under this system, shoemakers were no longer journeymen working for a master, but rather employees doing piecework in 10-footers or manufactories for their employers, who were entirely divorced from the production process. This created a social, physical, and economic divide that was non-existent before industrialization. This model of handwork continued until the shoemaking process was mechanized with the development of the sewing machine in 1858, the pegging machine in 1851, and the lasting machine in 1883. By the 1890s, shoe factories were fully mechanized and centralized, making 10-footers and the labor model we see at Augustus Salisbury obsolete. So these are a few other pictures of the shoes that we have, the shoemaking tools that we have at Salisbury. So that upper left is some of the actual shoe leather with the tacks still in them. And then this pictures in the middle here are not 100% confirmed, but I'm pretty confident that it is a burnishing tool that you can see here in the bottom right. So that would be used to burnish the soles of the shoes and to add wax around the low. But it's also important to emphasize the transition in this context. From documentary research, we know that there were people working at a centralized manufactory and living in multifamily boarding houses in the center of Grafton while these 10-footers were still in operation throughout the town. Therefore, we must question why shoemakers would choose to live and work in one location over the other. Again, Matt will get into this more in more detail, but at its core, shoemakers working in a remote shop would have had more control of their hours, their tempo, conversation, and consumption habits rather than those under close supervision in a factory. To re-emphasize transition, shoemaking continued to be done in conjunction with farming throughout the first half of the 19th century, as these 10-footers would have allowed more flexibility. It's likely that many people at the site, including women and children, would have participated in both farming and shoemaking in various capacities at different points during the year. As previously stated, this would have allowed families to build capital and enjoy the freedoms afforded by a rural lifestyle. However, compared to the previous century, shoemaking was a competitive industry, meaning that this mode of dual production became increasingly difficult to maintain, as more time would have had to been spent doing either agriculture or shoemaking. Additionally, the mechanization and subsequent centralization of the shoemaking process would have forced laborers to either pursue industry in a city or agriculture in rural areas. So I think that was...
All right, now I'll talk about some other artifacts. So what I'd like to do is explore the various interpretive possibilities provided by the artifact assemblage from the Salisbury site and the ways in which we use the more evocative artifacts to describe and characterize specific groups of people represented on the site. I'm going to place special emphasis on bottle glass assemblage because I'm really into bottle glass, and I think it's also can be especially evocative. And bottle glass from the 19th century can be typed and dated using resources such as the Society for Historical Archaeology's bottle identification page to provide rich interpretive possibilities. And while bottle reuse, depositional lag, and the secondary bottle trade pose significant issues to interpretations and must be strongly considered, the interpretations and ideas that follow mostly account for this. As a rural site in Grafton, the Salisbury site is likely what we consider like the end of the road for most of these bottles, meaning that even if they were subsequently reused on the site, they probably at least initially arrived there containing the product that corresponds to the container type. I'm sure exceptions exist on the site, and an archaeologist can never be sure what was bottled in a given container without a label or anything. But as Lauren has mentioned, stratigraphic and spatial analysis is very challenging on the site and largely unhelpful. So these artifacts are going to be interpreted largely just on their presence on the site alone, rather than when and how they were deposited. So first, I want to explore how some of the bottle glass speaks to the labor situation that Lauren just described, in terms of both the benefits and consequences that occupants likely experience and their potential class identity. One lens I believe is particularly productive for this interpretation is the concept of alcohol consumption and leisure and its development at this time in the 19th century. The Salisbury site would have afforded its occupants advantages over their contemporaries in terms of leisure. By the middle of the 19th century, the idea of leisure developed in the working class largely due to increasing industrialization and the control by employers over their employees' pace and activities while at work. In a factory setting, employers restricted workers' abilities to drink, smoke, gamble, or take breaks, whereas before, these activities were often integrated into and done throughout the workday in the artisan's shop or around the farm. For factory workers, this forced these activities to find new times and places to occur and resulted in an idea of leisure or free time that was separate from the rest of the day. At the Salisbury site, in addition to better determining the pace, output, and schedule of their work, farm laborers or shoemakers in a 10-footer model would have had more of an opportunity to consume alcohol throughout the day compared with their contemporaries in controlled industrialized settings, something which they may have considered customary and also important, making the site especially attractive to them even when the pure economic benefits may not have been so clear. Likewise, working as a farm laborer or shoemaker in a 10-footer on a rural site outside of town likely put these workers largely out of the public eye while drinking, something very significant in context of temperance efforts and prohibitory legislation at the time. I'm still in the process of determining what alcohol-related legislation exists on the local level in Grafton. In addition to, but we do know about the many local temperance groups that were very active in the area. But we can also see the temperance efforts through the state back and forth legislation during the 19th century. So in 1852, the state had a poorly enforced dry law, then that was followed by an 1868 transition to a licensing system, and then back to a prohibition in 1870, but with beer and light wine exempted, and finally to an 1873 local option and high licensing system. So as this back and forth demonstrates, temperance was a significant issue in the public mind at this time, and drinking often carried a significant image of moral failure, degeneracy, and working class immigrant poverty. So perhaps then the potential for relatively inconspicuous consumption was an advantage at the Salisbury site for those who did not wish to be seen as intemperate and working class, and instead saw themselves and alcohol consumption differently. So one particularly interesting way the glass speaks to alcohol consumption and labor on the site is through the flasks in the assemblage that feature molded designs. Two in particular are especially evocative. This first one is a cornucopia and urn flask. It was likely blown in New England glassworks, either Keene Marlborough Street in New Hampshire or Coventry Glassworks in Connecticut, at some point between roughly 1815 to 1841. And this is a really common molded flask of the first half of the 19th century, yet as many archaeological examples illustrate. And I found an example that the National Park Service actually found one of the exact same molded flask in an 1890 to 1930 privy contest at the Fort Stanwix National Monument in New York. So these kinds of examples demonstrate these flasks were often curated and saw decades of reuse. The example of this flask from the Salisbury site demonstrates such reuse with its extensive high point wear. You can see this is kind of a close-up of one shirt of this piece, and it's very, very worn on the highest part of the embossing. So the example of this flask from the site that demonstrates such reuse with extensive high point wear suggests years of refilling and a deposition probably years after its manufacturing date. Perhaps a farmer or shoemaker on the site in the second half of the 19th century kept this flask on hand throughout the workday, sipping here and there freely as he desired. The imagery of this cornucopia flask, as the name suggests, is also worth discussing as an ancient symbol of plenty and a bountiful agricultural harvest, as is actually the urn that would have been on the back of the flask. These symbols may have had special resonance with the laborers at Salisbury. Perhaps they felt a sense of pride in their agricultural work and identity, especially in the context of this way of life that was becoming increasingly challenging to maintain. A symbol of bountiful harvest is also seen in another flask identified from the glass assemblage. A sheaf of wheat flask manufactured by Westford Glassworks in Westford, Connecticut from around 1860 to 1873. The sheaf of grain is a similarly old and evocative image of agricultural plenty, and again, likely a special meaning for those on the site who may have been proud to work the land in a more Jeffersonian sense rather than be a factory worker, which may have been considered above working class and more American. Yet, despite the benefits of likely not needing to separate leisure time from the workday due to the labor model on the site, it's also undeniable that the labor performed, both agricultural and related to shoemaking, was physically taxing and likely damaging to the body in the long term. Agriculture and associated domestic activity required heavy manual labor and the possibility of significant accidents. Shoemaking in the 10-footer model at the site likely involved repetitive motions while seated hunched over in a chair. Both these forms of labor could result in various aches and pains, arthritis, and other health concerns. The bottle glass assemblage suggests that laborers at Salisbury made efforts and investments in treating their aches and pains, as seen through the proprietary medicines represented. Often called patent medicines, although few were actually patented, proprietary medicines were unregulated, over-the-counter products advertised to cure a multitude of ailments, and often containing ingredients that were both ineffective at safely curing ailments, though perhaps temporarily effective at treating them and making the user feel better, as well as be dangerous if used in large doses or too frequently. Two of these such products identifiable from the glass assemblage speak specifically to the types of ailments agricultural and shoemaking laborers may have experienced. The first is the Stephen Sweets Infallible Liniment bottle. Blown in a two-piece hinge mold and featuring a smooth base, this bottle likely dates to the 1860s. Advertisements for the products are typical for proprietary medicines in the multitude of external and internal ailments the product claims to cure, but as a limited emphasis was placed on muscular and nerve aches and pains. So those are kind of the first things listed on this. Neuralgia, lumbago, stiff neck, joint strains, sort of thing. There's also even a connection to agricultural labor specifically, as the Sweet family was known in New England going back to at least the 18th century as a family of bone setters, specializing in treating injuries from agricultural accidents. So that actually mentions that on the Dr. Stephen Sweet of Connecticut, the great natural bone setter. So this reputation was used to market the product and likely resonated with agricultural laborers. Relatedly, as was common for many liniment products at the time, Sweet's Infallible Liniment was marketed for man or beast and said to cure horse health issues as well, once more potentially relating to agricultural labor on the site. So that's the bottom part. 2 horse owners. And then I was also able to identify another proprietary medicine, Professor DeGraat's electric oil, which was also chiefly advertised as a cure for pain. Said to be charged with electricity, DeGraat's electric oil seems to have hit the market in the 1850s and was continually sold until at least the turn of the century. Both these products point to a probable physical suffering that the labor model at Salisbury could have caused or contributed to. These products also prompt questions for further research regarding the availability of healthcare to site occupants. For example, could they only access over-the-counter drugs like these, or did they also have access to prescribed drugs from actual doctors? It also prompts questions about their economic status and willingness to invest in these products, as well as the class connotations regarding this type of consumption. And these are things I'm going to continue to explore in my ongoing research for my thesis. And here's a fun ad about this: the greatest cure in the world for pain. It's also worth mentioning the overlap between alcohol and medicine. First, ideas surrounding drinking and alcohol likely often overlap with medication, either explicitly or subconsciously. Likewise, many patent medicines at this time were in fact alcoholic, in addition to containing ingredients such as morphine. This prompts questions regarding whether patent medicine consumption could replace or hide drinking, perhaps in the face of prohibitory legislation or just the general temperance attitudes in the community, and again may represent an attempt to resist being seen as temperate and working class. So the next group of people at Salisbury that are highly visible in the archaeological record as well as the documentary record are children. Throughout the site Salisbury and post-Salisbury occupation, children were present at the site, numbering 36 in total, and making up nearly 31% of the site's identifiable occupants. Many artifacts attest to their presence, the first group being, of course, the doll parts, as you can see here. These are often called frozen Charlotte dolls today, because they're very rigid in stature, and there's this modern association of a moralizing Victorian tale of a woman who froze to death on a carriage because she wouldn't put on a coat because she was so proud of her dress. This is more of a modern idea. That probably wasn't a story that was being told at the time, but still a fun name. These doll parts are very common finds on late 19th century sites and are typically associated with girls. And then another fun artifact, a Lockwood Sun model cap gun from circa 1880 that Lauren was able to identify, points more toward boys and masculine forms of play. Both the gun and doll parts could be analyzed in terms of the way they reinforce gender norms, particularly for women and men, and to those of a certain class, but we have not performed that analysis yet either. However, I will mention that such a strong presence of children on the site and the evidence of their activity around the house does likely speak to the benefits parents likely identified in the arrangement at the Salisbury site, and that labor was occurring around the home and property. It differs, for example, from parents living in a more urban setting who worked in factories, as parents at Salisbury were likely more able to closely supervise and provide care for the children throughout the day. These children were also afforded the opportunity to grow up, at least temporarily, on a rural site away from the urban industrialized center, areas which were being increasingly seen as dangerous and unhealthy for children in the public consciousness. Again, perhaps the site model and setting carried preferential class connotations, as it was those that identified as working class who were more often unable to provide care for their children throughout the day. And then on a more morbid note related to children, connecting back to proprietary medicines found on the site, I've been able to identify two separate Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup bottles from the glass assemblage. The fragments on the left are in thinner glass and have an earlier looking embossing that seems to suggest an 1850s or 1860s manufacturer. And the other fragments on the right, which pertain to a different vessel, have thicker glass and a slightly later looking font, so that likely postdates the first bottle by a little bit. This product was manufactured and sold from around 1850 into the early 20th century, and was an extremely popular proprietary medicine marketed primarily towards treating teething children, or children who would not stop crying for other health reasons. The active ingredient in Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was a high dosage of morphine, making it an extremely dangerous product that came to be known as the baby killer. It often caused children either to sleep and not wake again, or to develop addictions that may have plagued them the rest of their lives. Still, this product was extremely popular, and again prompts questions regarding access and sources of healthcare available to Salisbury occupants, and whether a class connotation existed in how healthcare was acquired. Another identifiable group of occupants at Salisbury are Civil War veterans. From the documentary record, we know that 3 of the site residents served in the war: Lucius Boyden, who died in 1862 during the war, as well as Caleb Wheeler, who served from 1862 to 1864, and Elbridge Rogers, who served from 1862 to 1865. The fact that all of these men were employed as shoe or boot makers before their time in the military may speak to the impact of the war on the labor movement and vice versa. For the Civil War, a series of economic depressions in the industrial sector had created a growing divide between workers and their employers. However, the war shifted this conflict into North versus South and industrial versus rural, with all industrialists, both employers and laborers, uniting together against the rural South. This is all to say that these men's identities as shoemakers likely impacted their identities as Northerners during the war. And then we do know that both Wheeler and Rogers subsequently lived at Salisbury after their service, and so we can use some of the artifacts from the glass assemblage to speak to their potential experiences as veterans. So I've been able to identify 2 bitters bottles that likely correspond to the time period when Wheeler and Elbridge were on the site. Bitters, which were most often highly alcoholic herbal mixtures marketed as medicines, were often sold to soldiers during the war to treat their many health complaints, as well as to prevent specific diseases such as malaria that Northern soldiers were unfamiliar with and very wary of. My preliminary research into this has tentatively suggested that many veterans carried their habits of drinking bitters with them after the war. This could have been either possibly due to a trust in the products that may have seemingly gotten them through the war, as treatment for persisting ailments that they had acquired in the war and persisted afterward, or just because of addiction. Self-medication due to both physical and mental trauma may have been more acceptable to others in the form of bitters consumption, especially given the class connotations of intemperance. The first bitters bottle I identified from a few small fragments spread across the site is the C.H. Atwood's quinine bitters from Boston. These bottles seem to have been produced and used from around 1860 to 1870. This was an extremely challenging identification for me because there were only like 2.5 small letters on that one shirt. But I was fortunate enough to find a collector's website with pictures of a complete example that I have pictured here and some corresponding research. The fact that this product was specifically a quinine bitter supports the idea that one of the veterans on the site may have developed some level of affinity for this product or a similar quinine product while using it to avoid or treat malaria during the war, and then continued consuming this kind of product on the site. And then a slightly less compelling example, but still a bitters bottle, is this Dr. Langley's Root and Herb bitters from Boston. This was sold in the 1850s throughout the turn of the century, and many variants of this bottle occur. And so with only 4 refitting fragments, I can't really say exactly when this bottle was made, but still it can be seen as pointing toward the experience of Civil War veterans, while also connecting to my previous discussion of medicine and alcohol. It's also worth mentioning that actually in the same Stephen Sweet's infallible limit ad from earlier, it also specifically mentioned soldiers, demonstrating another overlap there and speaking to the broader continuing health issues that veterans face. the soldier's friend. This documentary record speaks strongly to immigrants at Salisbury. The documentary record mentions Irish immigrants and French Canadian immigrants, and this kind of follows the patterns of immigration in Worcester County that we see in the documentary record. The Smith, Casey, and Murphy families who lived on the site from the 1860s to the 1870s are all listed in census records as Irish immigrants, while the Baker family of the 1880s were French Canadian. This corresponds to immigration trends in Worcester County, with the Irish immigrants predominating in the mid-19th century and eventually being matched and even outnumbered by French Canadian immigrants by the turn of the century. The number of immigrants at the site, especially in its later period of occupation suggests that economic and class position played a strong role in who lived there once shoemaking had largely ended at Salisbury. With Irish and French Canadian immigrants seen as working class and inferior, perhaps the rural agricultural Salisbury site was one of the only available living and working situations for its later occupants who potentially could not afford to live and or were not accepted elsewhere. So far, we've largely avoided trying to identify identity in the artifact assemblage, because this is going to require a lot of care and critical thought involving disentangling stereotypes from cultural practice and identity, especially those related to drinking. But there are, however, some initial connections we can try to make to the materiality of Irish immigrants. While we're still working on processing and going through and identifying the clay tobacco smoking pipes, some of the pipes that we have identified with maker's marks have been various companies based in Glasgow that at the time were mass producing Irish patriotic pipes. Often they had phrases on the bowl like home rule. Here's an example of one of those. We don't have any such bowl fragments identified as of yet, but the analysis is ongoing. It's an exciting possibility that some of these pipe fragments correspond to one of these pipes and may speak directly to the Irish immigrant experience, especially in terms of the persecution these people so often face. And then just on the topic of smoking on the site more broadly, to make a specific class connection in the amount of pipe fragments present in the pipe as cutties. Cutties were shorter stemmed clay pipes with the end shaped to allow them to be held in the mouth without the need to be held by hand. So they kind of tapered at the end, were much shorter stemmed. In the late 19th century, smoking was often lumped together with drinking as a dirty, immoral vice, engaged in most often by working class folks and immigrants. More acceptable forms of smoking to the middle and upper classes were done in private, either at home or in an eating house or gentleman's club or similar type of establishment. And they were in the form of more expensive cigars. And if they were instead using clay pipes, this was done with mostly long, elaborate pipes that would have necessitated a careful, kind of intentional, more ritualized smoking. So in contrast, short-stemmed cutties, which we have on the site, were much more affordable and allowed the user to smoke hands-free and while working. Not only are the pipes in the assemblage cutties, but one cutty pipe even shows evidence of even further modification, perhaps after a break or to enhance its function even further. So this top left picture is actually upside down. You can see towards the end, it's probably been broken for some reason and then has been carved to kind of taper. So it either broke and then was modified to fit in the mouth again, or the person who bought the pipe still thought it was too long and broke it and made it even shorter to smoke it even more easily while working. So all of this suggests that smoking while laboring throughout the day occurred at the site, demonstrating an adherence, whether intentional or not, to what would have widely been seen as working class smoking habits. Though again, such consumption was likely inconspicuous to the setting of the site. And then one potential way to try to maybe understand French Canadian immigrant identity and experience with the archaeology could be this concept of la sous-traitance, forgive my French accent, which refers to the resistance by French Canadians to Anglo-American culture and the preservation and promotion of a distinct French identity and culture. Lauren and I haven't been able to figure out if any archaeologists have actually engaged this concept, and if they have, those papers are probably in French, which we can't read, but we're excited by that possibility, and we think it could be a compelling avenue to explore potentially. Okay, and then I'm going to try to run through this more quickly. This is just a really weird example on the site. So we have around 16 at least of these prescription type bottles. They are called in the manufacturing literature the Philadelphia oval shape. Is just an example. All of ours are unembossed, but they're all very uniform, all about the same size. They all seem to they are clustered spatially. They all seem to come from the same area. And so one advantage of this shape would be that it fits well in the pockets and there are no sharp corners. So it's a very popular type of container all through the late 19th century. And the ones that we have seem to be kind of an earlier one that's more of a transitional shape and seem to correspond to the early to mid 1870s. And what's interesting is there's little to no discernible use wear on these bottles. They seem to, especially in comparison to the other glass, that's very, very clean, unworn. So seemingly deposited all together at once in one event without really being used. So I'm going to run through some interpretive possibilities. So if we think of it in terms of consumption, I mean, the obvious thing would be, oh, somebody was really sick. They were consuming this same product over and over again. But because of the type of this bottle, it's more related to a kind of a drugstore rather than a more proprietary medicine. And this is just too many vessels to be consuming for that. It's just a lot. And especially if it's from a drugstore, you wouldn't want to be continually buying the same, like that product and not returning the bottle. Because you're paying a deposit, like not a deposit fee, but like a container charge every time. Another idea I had in terms of consumption was relating it to the shoemaking, although the timing is kind of off on there. Shoemaking kind of seems to have ended by the time that these bottles were probably deposited. Another idea I had was relating it to Olive Rogers, who we talked about, who's the single mother who took in a bunch of laundry. Potentially she's using some kind of bluing or other laundry product that might have been bottled in these containers. And then another idea would be if it was some form of alcohol potentially prescribed by a doctor. I found a lot of documents talking about from temperance societies who were complaining that doctors would often like overprescribe alcohol that really wasn't for medicinal use. It's just kind of, especially in light of the prohibitory legislation, depending on what time period you're talking about, it might have been a workaround those laws. But the question is, if it's consumption, why would you accumulate these? Why would you save them? Unless it was a container of unused products that then, got thrown away, it doesn't really make sense. And it points to a one-time depositional event rather than consumption over a period of time, since all of these items are very uniform and deposited together. So what I am kind of thinking more so is that this might speak to some form of production, and that this deposit can be interpreted as like a box of unused empties that got thrown away when whoever was doing that activity moved out. So one idea that I had was, is this some sort of more local proprietary medicine that's being made? Is someone capitalizing on the local history and knowledge that people would have had that this was on Nipmuc land and that there were Nipmuc healers previously on the land? And that would kind of correspond to this container type because they're not embossed, they're pretty generic, probably could have been acquired for relatively a little amount of money. But what I think is a more compelling idea is that there was some small local community-based distribution of alcohol going on. There's this concept of the shebeen that's really popular at this 1860s, 1870s time, especially in Irish communities, of a kind of like kitchen tavern or kitchen saloon, and this is just small scale alcohol distribution outside of someone's home. And this is especially common in Ireland, but also then in America among widowed women. And it's kind of seen as a legitimate way to make money when your husband has a source of income, and that there's even a kind of sense that the community should support this business venture. So while all of this wasn't Irish, this idea could have still existed in the community. And again, going back to the shape with the bottles fitting nicely in the pocket, this might have been a way to distribute alcohol in a more covert fashion if it wasn't locally acceptable. And then even there's probably significant overlap between alcohol and medicine, like I've talked about earlier. It could have been whatever was being bottled could have been bottled at like being advertised as medicine or kind of being labeled as medicine, but was really mostly alcohol. We don't really know. So that's something really interesting. I'm trying to sort out, and I'm just going to try to figure out with more research which of these interpretations or another interpretation makes the most sense. So to conclude, both the documentary and archaeological evidence point to families and individuals with different identities and positions, many of which are overlapping and were likely changing and under continued formation and varying levels of tension. This offers a wide variety of interpretive avenues to explore and allows us to paint vivid portraits of the site's occupants as we try to use the archaeology to capture the processes of industrialization and class formation that we are investigating. Overall, though class is elusive and class identities in the American consciousness were still under development in the mid to late 19th century, much of our evidence points to working class identities that are under tension by folks struggling to either improve their economic situations and class position or navigate class identification through varying consumption practices. Further research will help us decide which of these portraits we've laid out for you are the most compelling and can speak most strongly and accurately to the experiences and identities of occupants at the Hassanamesit Woods Augustus Salisbury site. So thank you very much for listening. We'd also like to thank the Physics Center for the research and access to their collections, the Hassanamesit Nipmuc, who have been close collaborators on the entire Hassanamesit Woods project, and the Grafton Land Trust, who owns the property that was excavated. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We will now take questions from our live audience and from anyone who's watching via Zoom. If you want to put anything into the chat, I will relay it to our speakers. Yes.
One thing I noticed back around doing lumber collecting is the propensity to find a lot of vanilla extract on it,
Yeah.
because it had a high alcohol content.
Right.
You could get that, you couldn't find booze during prohibition.
Yeah.
So that played into some of this as well.
Right.
You're a little earlier on the site, but
Exactly.
yeah.
But I think that's the right kind of thinking, that there's probably some engagement with alcohol, and it might be related to another product, whether that's medicine or an extract or something like that. I think there's a connection there that I'm trying to figure out.
Either one of you, did you happen to notice when the word cobbler came into use as opposed to shoemaker?
Yeah, so cobbler actually refers to someone who repairs shoes, whereas shoemaker is someone who's doing full shoe production. As far as the date on that, everything is real iffy. We see people who are even in 1870 listed as cordwainers, which is another kind of older term for shoemaking. So I think it really just emphasizes the transitionary, like, kind of, part of the shoemaking industry is that since it is something that has been a tradition for so long, like you get these old words that are used much longer than other, forms of labor. Yeah, I think cobbler I was seeing still in 1860 from some people, 1860, but that was distinguished from shoemaker on census records. And even, as things start to get more specialized, you see people listing themselves by what they're doing in shoemaking rather than just shoemaker. You have, that shoe treer that I mentioned, or like putter or clicker. Like there's all of these different kind of identities.
Yeah, it's like super technical terms too that is hard I can tell it's been hard for us to like figure out what that meant back then to those people and what it might mean now, and all these different, we don't have full access to the long list of terms that these people were probably familiar with related to shoemaking.
I noticed dark green bottles and brown bottles.
Yeah. Right.
Is that the way it went as far as production glass?
Not necessarily. Yeah, there's overlapping. This also just kind of pertains to, there are a lot of different factors, but it also pertains to what was being bottled. The colorless glass ones, that more pertains to if it's a medicine or something, because they're mostly like prescription pharmacy type bottles, I guess, just being like visible on what they contain. Yeah, I'm not so sure. Yeah, there's just a variety of factors. So it's not necessarily a trend. I didn't mean to make it into a trend that way. Yeah, there are a variety. Certain products people prefer to be in darker containers, or You know, that's also a way to disguise kind of what's in it, potentially. So yeah, lots of different reasons, but that's not necessarily like a technological trend.
I have a question about, talking about the 10-foot model.
Yeah.
Exactly is that?
Yeah, so 10-footers are kind of where between the like domestic, so early on, you'd just be producing shoes in your barn, like just families making shoes for themselves. 10-footers come a little bit later, where there would be kind of, yeah, that's from the museum in Essex, yeah. You can actually,
Small.
yeah, it's 10 by 10 foot square, that's why they're called 10-footers. Be multiple people,
Yeah.
so, yeah, so typically, like.
So it's like a shoe shed.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like, it's between a factory and like domestic production, so there's like 6 people. Yeah, like 5 to 10 people, because I mean, not 10 to 10, but they're a little bigger, you know, but I would say about 6 people in the thing. Yeah, but again, that kind of leads into the whole culture of it all. Like if you're working with just a couple people, you can talk very freely. Yeah, and you know that shoemakers are also very political, because you can kind of read while you're working, or they would employ, you know, the younger boys who are being apprenticed, they would go and they would read to the workers while they're working. There's a lot of cool stuff happening in the 10-footers at that time.
So most of your architecture stuff was from up to 1900.
Yeah.
What happened to the area afterwards?
Yeah, so the house burned somewhere around the turn of the century. And the couple who bought the property after Salisbury and were renting it out had been in the process this whole time of acquiring all the parts of the land on the hill, Keith Hill. And then around the turn of the century and early 20th century, start converting it all into orchard.
Oh.
And they became a really big orchard family. Yep.
How were you able to locate exactly where the site was from all the records, or?
And the Stellar Foundation is visible too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was.
Yeah, and from previous excavations too, like we've uncovered like a wall, and some, you know, kind of boundary features from the house as well, so.
So we have a 10-foot left behind us here.
Oh, really?
Dave's original shoe.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
You made a point early on saying that you couldn't do much spatially with this. And you alluded to the stratigraphy, which to me, so what? Stratigraphy is less relevant.
Right.
Why are you saying that you can discern no pattern at all, or
Right. So
the artifacts are completely,
well, one issue is kind of the same. I mean, you can see we have gaps.
yeah,
But yeah, so like I was finding pieces of the same vessel, like here and all the way there.
so
So like things are being probably smeared around.
but is it like a sheet tin disposable?
Right, it's some of that.
Or was this
Well,
then converted to agricultural use later on?
right, it's some of that, but there's melted and burned material that must be probably from the burning of the house that right across the whole thing. So that kind of clued us in that there's some significant like smearing going on. But then again, like some certain things do seem to be clustered in some of it,
That sort of.
the bottle cap.
I know there are 2 confirmed features, the one is kind of.
Right.
Like a garbage pit, if you want.
Yeah.
To say. That seems to be pretty intact, and then a much earlier, like 18th century feature that is not associated with Salisbury. That's on the those 2 units on the very southern end, are that early feature, so.
Unrelated to that, you talk about making shoes, where are they getting their leather?
Well, so,
So,
yeah, also from Grafton, yeah.
Do they have a specific person you can tie back and say, these are the people who canned it?
Well, so we do have lists of tanneries in town and people who owned the tanning businesses, like the manufacturers who would have owned that. But as far as like where Salisbury, like this site specifically would have been getting leather, we're actually going to the Grafton Historical Society next month, and they're going to be looking at some of the store records and the shoemaking leather records. But that's kind of why both businesses do so well in Grafton, because they're feeding off of each other.
I mean, like here, the next town over is the major tanning.
Yeah.
center.
Yeah. again, it's like agriculture, you know, it's kind of hard to develop, but they do a lot of, you know, you're raising.
Yeah, well, this is
houses.
my final question. You talk about them being either shoemakers or farmers, and if you look at the New England model.
Yeah.
It's, you do both.
Yeah.
No, yeah, exactly. That's,
And then I'm wondering when the census are taken,
Yeah.
that you were farming at that
Right,
point in
yeah.
time,
Yeah.
but the census was taken in
Yes.
December, so
Exactly.
you were making shoes at another time.
Yeah.
And you've gotten that into your.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep, we're definitely talking a lot about that. And again, I think that you see that later, and I think the census records are hard too, because
Right.
it's how much are people saying, but then there is an amount of standardization where the record taker has to kind of put something down as well. But I think you do see a transition from like the shoemaker to like works in shoe factory that happens.
Well, I think, yeah, but I think that more in terms of like other.
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, we think-
especially,
Affected them much later.
right, yeah.
yeah, I think that what we've kind of decided, I think, is that like in the Salisbury period of occupation, it's definitely both going on together and people are probably doing the same thing. It's the later period where the shoemaking probably dips out because it's just not economically competitive anymore. And it's probably mostly farming.
Because things do become centralized by like the late 1860s, 1870s in town. So like this kind of rural model just isn't conducive to that kind of, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Mhm.
I don't think so. There are no comments online. If anyone has any, put them in now. Otherwise, any last questions? Got one more?
They've been told that this is they who had this shoe factory in the early 1900s. One of the first ones to develop right and left shoes.
Mhm.
Did you find that they were in fact straight left
I
on
think,
your site?
yeah, the toe pieces seem to be more straight last than anything. So that's definitely speaking to like an earlier form of it as well. Mhm.
Was there any specialty shoemaking or?
Well, a few different sizes of glass.
Yeah, yeah, so.
But yeah.
There you go. Yeah, so you can see that these on the very bottom are really large, and then the ones at the top are only this big, like very small, so. And knowing that this is probably more boot and like sale shoe production, like this isn't refined shoes that would have been for like a high market. It's more likely that those are children's shoes rather than women's shoes, just given the size of it. But yeah, we do have multiple pairs, and multiple sizes. So it does speak to like kind of a mass production rather than just making one type of shoe, like one shoemaker would not have had so many lasts. We think that there were multiple people working in the tent that are, working on several lasts at a time.
Any other questions? Well, let's thank you guys again. This was excellent. And thank you for joining us.